Are there any questions that didn't get answered or asked prior material before we move on? Nope. All right. So for the remainder of the course, the next, tonight and then the next two classes, we are going to be focusing the discussion using a text, just a brief, short text that is written by Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder. I think I maybe have mentioned the founder of the particular school of Tibetan Buddhism, the Gelug tradition that our center is based on. And so his writings are kind of, um, in terms of commentaries, of course, you have the sutra material from the Buddha, which is, the direct primary source. And then you've got people who came after, the Buddha and wrote commentaries on the sutras. And the commentaries, just as a literary tradition, are incredibly helpful because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of sutras. And so it's an incredibly vast body of work because the Buddha basically just kind of wandered around for, yeah. You have a question?
Did I hear you say right that all sutras are by the Buddha?
Yep.
Okay, just want to make sure I got that right. Thank you.
So we do have that primary source, the teachings of the Buddha, which were written down in what we call sutras. And so, but the Buddha basically wandered around for 50 years and benefited everyone that he came across by giving them individually information, teachings that they would be able to use in their own lives to make spiritual progress. Um, so the study of the sutras themselves is very difficult, and really for us, not even, I would say, not even possible because so many of them aren't even available in English. However, so it's certainly the case that there's a reliance on commentaries written by great masters who came after the Buddha, who did kind of all of that heavy lifting for us. And because Lama Tsongkhapa founded our particular tradition, that's generally the scholar that is looked to for commentaries. Maybe in some, and it depends. That's certainly not always true. There's writings by many other Indian masters, Nagarjuna, Shantideva, Chandrakirti. There's a number of different scholars that are looked to for many different things. But Lama Tsongkhapa certainly plays a primary role in scholarship for the Gelug tradition. So we will be using a brief text that he wrote, which is called a lamrim prayer. I think I may have introduced the concept of the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment, is what lamrim in English means. Stages of the path to enlightenment. And its goal, as I mentioned, it's part of this commentarial lineage. So its goal is to look at the sutra material and to extract all of the most essential points of the Buddha, and to organize them in a systematic, logical framework that we are able to pick up and really make incredible use of, which is so much easier than trying to go through all of these thousands and thousands of pages of sutra material. Because if you imagine, the Buddha sometimes came across people who were beginners. And he also sometimes came across people who were very advanced, who had done a lot of meditation, who had done a lot of work on kind of clearing out these um, negative familiarities, habituation. Um, and so he was to those two different types of people, he gave explanation of the teachings in two very different levels of difficulty or sophistication. It would be very much like if somebody was following around Neil deGrasse Tyson as he traveled around the world and sometimes gave talks to elementary schools and sometimes gave talks to, conferences of the greatest minds in astrophysics. If you were to collect all of those talks from Neil deGrasse Tyson, it would look like some of it didn't make sense because he would give a very simplified presentation to some folks and a very complicated presentation to other folks who could understand. And the Buddha did the same thing. The Buddha didn't try to only present one way of understanding. He would teach to the level of the student that was in front of him, which makes the sutras particularly challenging to kind of extract the essence of. But we can rely on these incredible masters like Lama Tsongkhapa, who came before, to do that work for us. And that is something that is a really important part of how the study of Buddhism is approached. So I mentioned Lama Tsongkhapa, but there was a scholar, Lama Atisha, who actually came before Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Atisha is responsible for bringing uh, Buddhism from India to Tibet. As we've said, our center is part of Tibetan Buddhism, which really means it's a container for Indian Buddhism that existed at a particular time. Unfortunately, Buddhism in India was very much affected by a lot of social upheaval, some uh, military, militancy, some violence, and really kind of got wiped out within India for long periods of time due to these upheavals. Yep. Mhm.
Sorry, you said he brought Buddhism from India to Tibet. This man right
Mhm.
here?
Yes,
Okay.
Lama
Thank
Atisha. Yeah. Yeah.
thank you.
So Atisha is kind of responsible for bringing, as I said, the sort of Buddhist philosophy from these existent Indian monasteries, traveling with those teachings and bringing it to the people of Tibet. Um, so he was the first person. He wrote a text called Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, which was kind of the very first effort of this sort of lamrim tradition, where these incredible scholars would look at the sutra teachings and try to condense it for practitioners, for lay practitioners, and I mean even for monastics, but would try to provide a simplified version that actually explains step by step where does a person start? What do they try to familiarize their mind with at first? And then how do they progress? Because as I mentioned, it's called the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the idea is that a person progresses through all of these different stages of internal mental development that was presented by the Buddha and is just being packaged in a very um, logical way by these great masters. They're basically saying this is what the Buddha meant to explain to people if he was going to be able to, if you could combine everything that he said to beginners, everything that he said to intermediate level practitioners, everything that he said to advanced practitioners, you begin to see that the Buddha's intent is for people to move from being a introductory level practitioner to being a middling level practitioner to being a great level practitioner. And so everything that he taught is really meant if a person is learning about all of this for the first time, then the Buddha's intent is that a person traverse all of those stages within their own mind. And you just kind of have to um, distill the essence of those different types of practitioners into one continuous path of training. So, Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment was the first written effort to do this. Um, as you can see, Lama Tsongkhapa's dates are here, and they're hundreds of years after Lama Atisha, who himself was over 1,000, was over 1,500 years after, um, the Buddha, because the Buddha was 2,500 BC, and these are AD. So you can see Lama Tsongkhapa didn't live that long ago. It was just really, 600-ish years that he died, which is 2,000 years after the Buddha's lifetime. So really, relatively speaking, quite recent. This lamrim tradition is quite a recent development, comparatively, speaking. Um, but it isn't Lamp for the Path that we're going to be using. It's a different lamrim text. The lamrim text that we're going to be using is called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. You can Google that, The Foundation of All Good Qualities, and Lama Tsongkhapa, and you can get your own copy of it. It's just maybe 2, 3 pages. So that's what's going to inform all of our classes for the remainder of the course. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay, so as I alluded to, the lamrim is organized into 3 scopes, the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope. And the idea is that this is being presented kind of like on a population. It's almost like um, an academic curriculum that's being developed, and it's sort of being deployed on a population scale. It's kind of like, how would you come up with a comprehensive system for taking a person who's only just starting to learn about Buddhism and then gradually condition their mind, and help them to develop the familiarities, the competencies, the skills that they need to transform that mind from ordinary mind to enlightened mind. So it's very much kind of like a comprehensive course of study, kind of like, elementary school, middle school, high school, or what have you. So it's very much progressive in that way. But the what it turns on, these 3 scopes, they turn on the motivation of the practitioner who is engaging in them. So, as I said, it's the idea is that it's one continuous path of practice. So the hope would be that we would become practitioners of the great scope. That's the goal. That's the end point. Just like you might say, oh, I want to be a doctor when I grow up, which would mean that you would have to do well in high school, you'd have to do well in college, you'd have to then go to medical school and pass your medical boards and, do a residency. And after you've done all of those things, now you are a doctor, but you're just aspiring to that. Like that's your kind of future goal. And you also do understand, what are the steps that are involved between now and then? What is it that society has laid out for moving in that direction? And that's what the Buddha here has also done. So a small scope practitioner, so because we are aspiring to the great scope, the way that they phrase the small scope and the middling scope is that a practitioner who aspires to the great scope would engage in the practices or the path of training that is held in common with practitioners of the small scope or the middling scope. Just like, again, you would say, oh, well, really, I really want to be a neurosurgeon, but I do know that I have to engage in the practices of a high school student, and then I have to engage in the practices of a college student. But my goal isn't to drop out after elementary school or high school. My goal isn't even to drop out just with a bachelor's degree. My goal is to fully, become a board certified neurosurgeon. And only when I do that am I really done. But still, there are these other paths of trainings that we have to, but of course, it's also true that some people do drop out, in high school. Some people do only get a bachelor's degree. But for a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, it is the great scope that is the goal. And so it's presented as, well, I'm not a small scope practitioner, I'm not a middling scope practitioner, but I do have to engage in the practices that are held in common with those practitioners, keeping in mind the understanding that the goal is to always progress. The goal is to just do that and master that and then move on. So a small scope practitioner is someone who is motivated by understanding that their mind is a separate phenomena from their physical form, and that their mind is able to, and often has, experienced certain incarnations, like we would say that right now we're incarnated in the human realm, which we've talked about before, these sorts of different realms, and how they're kind of slices of experience. There's upper limits and lower limits to each of these realms. There are realms that are significantly less pleasant than the human realm in terms of the slice of experience that those beings typically are accessing. So there are lifetimes that sentient beings are experiencing that are marked with suffering that is more intense than what we normally would be up against, what we normally would understand. And a practitioner of the small scope is someone who understands that their mind functions that way and is motivated to avoid those most intense kinds of painful circumstances. So what they want to do is they want to close the door to those types of experiences. They want to eliminate the causes that give rise to those experiences, because it's not random, it's not causeless, it is caused by certain karmic actions. So that practitioner is really just motivated to do that. But they devote they orient themselves in, day and night, you could say, that they're with their whole body and mind to accomplishing that goal. And that's a profound reorientation, spiritually speaking. So it isn't anything to denigrate, because they are completely motivated to avoid creating non-virtue. They are wholeheartedly dedicating themselves to the practice of virtue, in order to close the door, as I said, to these most painful kinds of experiences. So you can see that if a person is if a person is directing the bulk of their energy, their effort, their time, their interest into making the rest of this life more comfortable, more enjoyable, more pleasant, that's not even a practitioner of the small scope from the Buddhist perspective. They've not yet entered the small scope. Um, you could say they are, aspiring to enter the small scope because they're not someone who is devoted wholeheartedly to the extent of non-virtue and negation of virtue. They're really just trying to make this, however many more years are, that they're going to be alive in this one incarnation, to make those as comfortable as possible. So entering the spiritual path is a real feat, from the Buddhist perspective. You only enter it when you can really say you've adopted that motivation, the motivation to really close the door to suffer, to the worst kinds of suffering. But that is not sufficient in terms of the overall Buddhist presentation, because it only closes the door to a certain type of suffering. As I said, the worst kinds of suffering, the most overtly painful types of suffering. We right now, as humans, are in what we would call one of the upper, kinds of experiences, one of the better types of experiences. And that's true even for the humans that are experiencing, disease, experiencing war, experiencing starvation, experiencing, you know, discrimination in various, ways, enslavement, all kinds of really painful things occur in the human realm. We know that to be true. Um, and so there are subtler kinds of suffering as compared to the worst kinds. So a practitioner on the middling scope is someone who begins to recognize that. They begin to see that it isn't sufficient to close the door just to a narrow band of suffering. They want to close the door to all suffering. And so a practitioner on this level would, if they stopped there, then they would be a Theravadan practitioner, because they would be motivated to achieve individual enlightenment, or lower nirvana. They would be motivated to not give rise to the causes of even like relatively good, ordinary lifetimes like ours. They would be motivated to achieve individual liberation and close the door to all ordinary rebirths of any kind. Um, for a great scope practitioner, though, this is also not sufficient, um, because a practitioner, as we've talked about in the previous two classes, a person can achieve individual liberation. That is a valid result of practice. However, the result of that is that they then become separated from all of the other ordinary sentient beings. And all of those ordinary sentient beings are still stuck in creating the causes of their own suffering. Um, and so a great scope practitioner is someone who now sees that that is true about the existential condition of sentient beings, and doesn't want to go for individual enlightenment, but wants to go for full enlightenment, so that that separation doesn't happen, so that their enlightened state is actually something that can be used to benefit sentient beings. beings rather than just remaining sort of separated or isolated from sentient beings. So this practitioner is motivated by not concern for oneself, but concern for others, concern for all of the other ordinary suffering sentient beings, and wanting to, yes, achieve enlightenment, but to do that because from the state of enlightenment, that that being is in the best position to bring about the welfare of ordinary sentient beings. Um, so that is what we are meant to aim for. But you can see that if if we never engage in the practices that close the door to the worst kinds of suffering, then we will experience those worst kinds of sufferings. And that will take us away from developing our mind because we'll have all of these detours in these really unpleasant states. So we have to engage in the practices of a small scale practitioner and bring about that result. We also have to develop a disenchantment with even these higher states of ordinary existence, because otherwise we'll think that this is good enough. We'll think that we can kind of stop here. And really, it, seems to me that over long periods of time, a person who does that would kind of at some point probably fall back into non-virtue. It's I would say that the momentum of virtue probably isn't something that you can maintain literally forever. You could probably create enough force, enough momentum to carry you through long periods of time. But under cosmic timescales, I would say that external forces are going to act uh, and on you in such a way that non-virtue kind of will assert itself, and then you're kind of starting not maybe from square one, but you're starting from a less than ideal place. Um, so um, so we really have to see that even the upper realms have disadvantages and that we shouldn't be attracted to the relative, of course, there are relative benefits compared to the lower realms, but compared to enlightenment, there's no benefit. There's no nothing of any value other than that um, if we play our cards right, we can create the causes and the conditions to have the ability to practice over, a number of lifetimes, with relatively good conditions and support and kind of all of the supportive internal and external causes and conditions. We can set ourselves up for that. And that's certainly beneficial, but it's kind of beneficial because it can lead to enlightenment. It's not really a good in and of itself. Any thoughts or questions about the three scopes? Okay, so we'll talk about the four features then of the lamrim. These are four advantages, four beneficial advantages that arise in the mind of the practitioner by studying the Buddha's teachings, particularly as they've been compiled and explained in this commentarial tradition where it's laid out in this way. So the first advantage is that we can see how none of the teachings are contradictory. Because as I mentioned, if a person was trying to just look through the sutra material, it would very much look like the Buddha said one thing to one person and said a contradictory thing to another person. Um, and because it's kind of, if the Buddha says, well, you should strive to put an end to the worst kinds of suffering to one person, and then he says to another person, you should strive for enlightenment. Those don't seem like they're the same thing. Those seem contradictory. Those seem like contradictory statements. But we can see how really what he was doing was giving advice for one person over the course of their training, and how at a particular time that is the right advice, and at a different time, under different circumstances, a different piece of advice is necessary. Just like when you learn, a really simplified and kind of wrong understanding of like how the cell works in first grade biology, they kind of say things that kind of aren't true about how, cells are. And then when you get to, you have a much more nuanced, much more accurate presentation of what a cell is, what electrons are, and, what protons and neutrons and all of those things, how they actually interact and so on. But you can't just go around telling kindergartners about, quantum mechanics. It doesn't work that way. Uh, so in that way, there are different states. Their goal is to lead one person in a systematic way. The second advantage is that we see that all teachings are personal advice. So we can understand how there's nothing that the Buddha taught that was just like an intellectual exercise or an anecdote. Everything that the Buddha taught is meant for us as a practitioner to understand suffering and how to overcome suffering. So we learn how to actually apply, because we can see, well, this advice is being given to me at this time for this reason to accomplish this purpose. And this other teaching is being given to me at a different time to accomplish this other uh, goal. And so I need to individually, we can't just say, oh, well, I aspire to the great scope. And so the small scope doesn't apply to me, or the middle scope doesn't apply to me. Um, we actually have to look at all of those teachings, as personal advice and put them into practice in order to get the result that we're looking for. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? Right, just pulling up a note here. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the next feature is what's called the threefold path. And we've talked about one meaning of the threefold path, which is that practitioners are meant to progress through these three levels of motivation: the motivation of wanting to close the door to the worst kinds of suffering, and then the motivation of wanting to close the door to all suffering, and then wanting to close the door to all suffering, not just for oneself, but for all sentient beings, without exception, every sentient being. That's one way of talking about the threefold teachings or the threefold path. The other way is to talk about the primary realization that is achieved by engaging in these three scopes. which is what they call renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view. Um, so renunciation is something that we'll get into all of these things as we go along. Renunciation is in English, it's kind of, it's kind of an austere, has this quality of austerity in a way. The definition or the direct English transliteration of the Tibetan word that we are translating as renunciation, the way that that word's understood is the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. They call it definite emergence. So it's renunciation has this idea of giving up something, right? Like we might renounce, fried food for, Lent, or we might go on a diet and say that we're renouncing pizza. It has this idea of giving up, but from the Buddhist perspective, what we're giving up is suffering. What we're turning our back on suffering. Um, so that can mean that that does mean we have to change some of our tendencies, some of our behavior, some of our default. We might, a person might think that a good way to get through their life is to manipulate other people and be deceitful. They might see that as an effective strategy for getting what they want because, they've kind of found that, well, people seem to give me things. I seem to be able to get resources and so on. Um, but at a deeper level, the Buddhist understanding would be that that person is sowing the seeds of their own suffering. And so they do have to give that up. They do have to recognize that being deceitful, being manipulative is not actually the way that we should be engaging in the world. Um, just like some people might amass, military power and terrorize, their neighbors, they might be able to get what they would want. And again, they do have to recognize that they're mistaken about that, and they do have to give that up. But really, we're turning our back on suffering more than anything else. Um, so that's renunciation, is the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. And then bodhicitta is the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And the correct view is this idea that we've talked about before, seeing the nature of reality directly. These are the three realizations that come out of um, progressing through the three paths. You can see that and um, so and really for Mahayana practitioner, um, there isn't like a one-to-one correlation because renunciation really is something that you work on both in the small scope where you are turning your back, as I mentioned, like on those really mistaken ways of engaging with the world, like, lying to people to get what you want, killing people to get what you want, that you have to set that aside. That's one level of renunciation. But then also, even on the middle scope, we're still kind of working on renunciation. We're now actually learning how to not give rise to the karmic causes, even of the kinds of lifetimes that are much better than those more suffering kinds of lifetimes. And that's a deeper, subtler level of renunciation. So then, really, it's on the great scope for a Mahayana practitioner where both bodhicitta and the correct view are presented. Because really, you're working mainly on renunciation over the first two scopes for a Mahayana practitioner, because there is no great scope in the Theravadan tradition. So, yep.
So you said as we work through the small, middle, and great scope, and we do that by working on the lamrim, correct? So as we work through those, we naturally get renunciation, bodhicitta, and correct view.
Yes, and so we'll see how as we go along, we'll look when we get to the foundation of all good qualities, we'll look at all of the parts of the lamrim, and we'll kind of see how that unfolds. But yeah, they're called these three are called the three principal aspects of the path. There's another, they're kind of the main realizations that a person has, if assuming that they actually master all of the topics of the lamrim.
Right.
Okay, and the last feature of the lamrim is that the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma. So again, here, this is like what I was saying before. When we understand how important the teachings of the small scope are and how transformative those contemplations are, then we understand that we're not above them, that we're not like, we can't just skip them. We can't just go right to the great scope. We get to the great scope by going through the small scope and the middle scope. So we understand, we generate a great deal of respect for all of the Buddhist teachings. We recognize that, I do need to actually create the causes and the conditions, uh, you know, of a practitioner of the small scope and a practitioner of the middle scope, then a practitioner of the great scope. So we practice everything that the Buddha taught and not say, well, the Buddha gave this because he was giving this for Theravadan practitioners who just want individual enlightenment. I'm a Mahayanist. I can ignore those teachings. That's a heavy negative way of misunderstanding the Buddha's intent. Okay, so now we are going to begin looking at this Lamrim text, the foundation of all good qualities, which begins with the contemplations of a practitioner that a practitioner of the small scope would be engaging in order to, as I say, close the door from the lower realms. Uh, which is again something that if we don't do, and we will be subject to that kind of suffering, and we're just making it incredibly difficult to achieve enlightenment because of all these detours that will keep happening, in these fortunate realms. So definitely something that we need to accomplish in order to set ourselves up to really be successful. Okay. So this is verse 1 of the foundation of all good qualities. Um, and this topic it's actually, in a way, in many presentations of the Lamrim, they will kind of separate this first contemplation out from the small scope. This is because this one contemplation, it really applies equally to all of the scopes. Um, and and so it's unique in that it's the first contemplation of the Lamrim. You can definitely say that. Um, but to say that it's technically part of the small scope isn't really correct, because it's often presented in the longer Lamrim texts. It would actually be before the chapter that would be labeled as like the small scope, because this insight, this contemplation is valid equally at all times for all practitioners. So this contemplation, and it isn't directly related just to accomplishing the aim of a small scope practitioner. It is just as important to accomplishing, it is just as important in the practice of a middle scope practitioner and a great scope practitioner. So here you can see uh, that this topic, this contemplation, is introducing the idea of what's the topic is called how to correctly relate to the spiritual guide or the guru, or the teacher. Um, so it's a difficult subject. It's a vast, complicated subject, and I think for Westerners in particular, it's quite a challenging topic. The idea here is that in order for us as individuals to know anything about the teachings, we have to come into contact with someone who has studied, someone who ideally has, gotten genuine realizations of these topics through long years of effort, maybe, lifetimes. Buddhism would probably say, in many cases, lifetimes of effort, and is therefore kind of uniquely qualified to be our guide through the material. Someone that we can check our understanding with, someone that we can ask questions of, someone that we can ask for personal advice about, I'm thinking about this practice, I'm thinking about that practice, can you help me to distinguish? So when they say, the kind and venerable guru, they're not just talking about, someone who's an elder student, someone who's a little bit, who's been thinking about this for a couple of more years than you have. It's really someone who has, particular qualities, who's really developed their mind, someone who's held broadly in very, very high esteem. And in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, perhaps in particular, there is an understanding that we do want to, as best we can, at some point, seek out personal relationships with people that are as close to this ideal as we can. Just like if you wanted to do anything, right? If a person, is thinking about going to graduate school or something, then they look at, well, this professor at this university is doing this kind of work. This lab is engaged in this kind of work, and I want to study under this particular person, and I don't really want to study under that particular person, because we understand like that this is just generally how it works. Like you come under the tutelage of people, mentors, tutors, whenever we want to really master anything, even at work, many times, we will try to get mentored by this person or that person, um, to become more like, to do our jobs more like the way that they do them, and so on. And it's really the same idea here. It's just that the work that we're doing isn't mundane. It's not just, being a better, you know, teacher or, bus driver or lawyer, or, it's actually the business of transforming ordinary mind into enlightened mind. So the stakes are much higher. Um, but that still, that ability to be guided, that ability to be led, and to come under the mentorship of teachers is an important part of the path. And as I said, Westerners can get kind of hung up on that. And I think definitely in the beginning, there's no need. There's also, I think, what happens is that people get frantic about the importance that they are understanding that Buddhism is placing on this idea, and they develop this, kind of frenetic need to rush into something, and that's also, deeply problematic. It's something that should unfold, over longer periods of time. And certainly we benefit from having access to books, having access to, live teachings, that are live, that are being streamed from all over the world all of the time with these great teachers. So there's a lot that we can actually do through, self-study. But Buddhism would say that there will come a point where we've gone as far as we can with that, and we should try to seek out being guided, being mentored, um, and um, and then the personal um, uh, realizations, the personal inner developments that we cultivate on the basis of that relationship are really, going to be profound. Uh, so it's certainly something that is emphasized, but again, I think, it's definitely not something, it's quite a serious, relationship, and it's not something that you want to rush into. And of course, here, it says that this text was written, as I say, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And at that time, there, really were almost no female teachers, which is not true in our present time. So although it genders this idea of the guru, that's just because this text is hundreds of years old, and there's such a veneration of texts in the Buddhist tradition that they're unwilling to kind of rewrite them to be reflective of the time. But there's no reason to think that a teacher is male as opposed to female. That just, historically speaking, was the case hundreds of years ago. So I know that, I mean, and of course we could teach, there are whole courses that you can take on each of these contemplations. But this class is really just meant to be a very broad overview. Um, any questions or thoughts or concerns about the first verse? No? Okay. So move on to verse 2. So verse 2 is introducing now, this is now kind of within the actual small scope. Um, and this topic is called Precious Human Rebirth. This, because that's in the stanza, precious human rebirth. So what you'll see here with this text, the foundation of all good qualities, it's what I might call a lamrim prayer, or I might call it a glance meditation on the lamrim, meaning that it's only going to give us one verse on each of the major topics. It's not really going to go into detail within the text itself. Um, and so its purpose is many people, many practitioners will memorize the foundation of all good qualities because, as I say, it's only about 2 pages, so it can be easily memorized. And then they will recite it every day. And of course, you can just recite it by reading it until you memorize it. Probably have it memorized in a couple of weeks. And so what it then is doing is it's taking you through the entire lamrim in a very brief period of time. So you are briefly being presented with all of the individual topics of the lamrim. It is, of course, necessary to actually study these in depth. And there are other texts that do that. And they are, of course, necessary to study. If a person, what I would say personally, I'm not qualified to like give advice, but what I have found to be helpful is it can be helpful to kind of read broadly, kind of just like read anything by His Holiness that looks interesting, etc., just to kind of read more broadly at the very, very, very beginning. But if a person feels like they would like to start studying um, the lamrim in more detail, um, then the book that I think is a good starting point is called Practicing the Path by Yangtze Rinpoche. Yangtze is Yangsi, and Rinpoche is Rinpoche, Yangtze Rinpoche. He's still alive. He's, not that old, probably 60s. Um, that book he wrote for the Western mind. Jennifer, did you have a question? You want me to spell that
Yeah,
for you again?
w- I got the spelling, but I didn't get the name of the book itself.
Practicing the Path.
Okay, practicing the path. Thank you.
So he wrote that as a book that was intended for a Western audience. He is a Tibetan, but he wrote it as a way of helping Westerners in particular to kind of begin to understand these topics in more detail. Eventually, people study what's called the Lamrim Chenmo. Lamrim is Lamrim, Lamrim, and Chenmo is Chenmo, Chenmo, Lamrim Chenmo. That's the great treatise on the stages of the path. Yangtze Rinpoche's book is a commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo, but his book is a couple of hundred pages. The Lamrim Chenmo is probably like 1,000. It's 3 volumes. But it's written in I would say it's written in a pretty easily understandable, relatively almost sort of conversational style. So I would say, it's not, for the most part, the last chapter or two is a bit dense, but for the most part, it's written in a pretty easily understandable style. And that's something that people eventually will study, is the Lamrim Chenmo, which is the definitive work in Tibetan, in the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism on the Lamrim Chenmo. Um, so those are just some thoughts about, studying these topics, because, but of course we are throughout this class, we will be looking at we will be fleshing out a little bit of detail on these stanzas. Okay, so verse 2 is, as I say, precious human rebirth. So understanding the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. So there's a lot to unpack here, but as I said, the motivation of a small scope practitioner is to close the doors to the lower realm, but not the upper realm. So it's certainly true that there are many advantages to having the kind of life that we ourselves possess compared to the lower realms. There are certainly many advantages to being born human. And not only being born human, but there's a subset of a human rebirth, which is called a precious human rebirth. Um, and a precious human rebirth is one that is characterized by certain specific causes and conditions. And that subset of a human rebirth is one in which it is very possible to make rapid and sustained spiritual progress. So that's what we want, right? We do, you know, um, we certainly want that kind of life. We want that best kind of life. At least on the small scope, that may be all we are aiming for right now. But as we'll see, even when we broaden our perspective, that kind of life is still the best kind of life for making spiritual progress, which is incredibly important, even if our goal is enlightenment, which will, come later. So, as I mentioned, it's a subset. Um, so, not every sentient being that is a human possesses this technical subset of a precious human rebirth. Um, so we'll look at what that means. We'll look at these specific causes and conditions for this subset. Um, so we'll look at first here, as I said, the freedoms. We'll look at what are called the freedoms. The freedoms are negative things that we are free from that could characterize our experience, but are not characterizing our experience. And so these are not having been born in, unfortunately, that what's called in English the hell realm, the spirit realm, the animal realm, or the celestial realm. The celestial realm is an upper realm, um, kind of above the human realm. And these are all disadvantageous states. The three lower realms are disadvantageous because there's more suffering than there is in the human realm. The celestial realm, is actually disadvantageous because there's no suffering in that realm. There's no overt suffering in that realm. And so the beings in that realm just kind of waste their time. They don't engage in practice. They're not, if they don't see suffering, if they don't experience suffering, they're not motivated to overcome suffering. So they're just kind of wasting their time in this upper realm, which is considered to be a disadvantage to having a much more productive kind of life. And so, but with these, it's true that every human um, is experiencing these freedoms. So these are in common with any human. But when we get to these other ones, we will see that there are humans who don't have these freedoms. So 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 for us in this lifetime, we can say that we have not been born at a time when a a Buddha has not taught, because we know that Shakyamuni Buddha appeared in our world and provided the complete path to enlightenment. So we are free from being, but had we been born 2,700 years ago or any other time prior to that, even on this planet, this wouldn't be true. We would be human, but we would be born at a time when no Buddha has taught. And within Buddhist cosmology, there's certainly an understanding that there are many world systems that are populated with humans where no Buddha has ever appeared. And that's a disadvantage, because if no Buddha has ever appeared, then then the number two, a place where the Dharma doesn't exist. By definition, the Dharma, meaning the teachings of a Buddha, can't exist. It's also true, though, that a Buddha could have come and taught, but subsequent to that, something happened and the Dharma doesn't exist anymore. And there are, even on our planet, there are places right now, countries with a great deal of repression, where there's no opportunity to meet these teachings. And in the past, there have been social upheavals, wars, and so on, and countries where the teachings have just never spread. So a place could be a local place. It could be, well, there's no internet, there's no freedom of travel. So in my local place, there is no Dharma. And that would also be a disadvantage because, you know, even 100 miles away, a Buddha could be teaching, but in your location, there's no teaching. And that would be disadvantageous. And then there's these two kind of personal, um, conditions. One is what's here called defective sense powers, and the other is wrong views. So the idea would be that if a human either had defective sense powers or held wrong views, then that would be disadvantageous as well. And defective sense powers, um, in general, the idea is having a body and mind that work well enough to be able to study and to meditate. Certainly, there are people whose bodies or minds do not work well enough for them to apply themselves consistently toward study and or meditation for a variety of reasons. Um, and that would, that would be a problem. That's an obstacle to spiritual growth. Maybe it's not a complete obstacle for all time, but for that particular sentient being in that particular lifetime, it is an obstacle to what otherwise could be. Um, and then wrong views would be holding, not having any space in the mind for what the Buddha is teaching because you're clinging to an opposing philosophical view and you're not open to the Buddha's teachings because of that. And, and again, there's nothing wrong with that, in one way of thinking. Of course, it isn't to criticize people who do hold what they might think of as contradictory views. But within the Buddhist framework, that framework is aimed at enlightenment. And if a person is holding a view that isn't going to allow them to engage in the practices that give rise to enlightenment, then from the Buddhist perspective, that is a disadvantage, that they could have accomplished enlightenment, but they were held back by a contradictory philosophical view. Uh, any thoughts or questions about the freedoms? So then we have the endowments, which are beneficial or positive things that do characterize our lifetime. So we had the freedoms, which were negative things that did not characterize our experience at present. Because again, even with what we just looked at, having a body and mind that works well enough to study and meditate, living in a place where the Dharma exists, those are changeable, right? Those might be true today and not true tomorrow. Our body and mind can stop working in that way, or there can be social upheaval or civil war or a nuclear, holocaust or whatever, or a great pestilence could, all of these things could happen. And these are changeable circumstances. It doesn't mean that just because we possess them now, we will always possess them. And many people at some point, as they get toward the end of their life, many people will not have a body and mind that really does work well enough for study and meditation. Um, so that person is kind of relying on all of the imprints of past study and meditation that they were able to engage in. So the hope really is just to have those intact capacities for as long as possible, because if we live long enough, probably at least for some period of time, we'll be alive, but study and meditation will not really be in the cards. Um, so these are positive things now, though, with the endowments that are characterizing our experience. And some of these are just the opposite of the negative things. So, for example, a Buddha has come, a Buddha has taught. The teachings that Buddha gave do still exist. And there are people alive on our planet who understand those teachings, who are putting them into practice, who are getting that result, who can explain things to us. And there are favorable conditions, meaning that there are places of learning, there are centers, there are monasteries, there are nunneries, there are retreat centers, there are people who are, willing to provide scholarships for people who wish to study and so on. There are favorable conditions in our world. It isn't like Buddhism is this pariah kind of tradition that is looked down upon or hated, or, we don't have to live in fear of practice. Um, so these are all really helpful. And these are circumstantial, meaning that they refer to the environment, they refer to the world in which we live. And then there are personal endowments, which refer to oneself. So again, being born human is one, which is nice. And then being born in what's called a central land, meaning, again, really meaning a place where the teachings exist, the teachings are being practiced. We do have intense sense faculties. We do have a body and mind that's serviceable, that works well enough to study and meditate. And it says here, not having committed any one of the five heinous actions, which is an English translation. Another English translation of that phrase are the five actions of immediate retribution. Um, it's it's a sort of a technical idea that there are certain karmic actions that are so powerful and so negatively powerful that if we were to commit them, then the karma, the negative karma of that act would necessarily, unless it was dealt with, it would necessarily ripen at the time of our death, which isn't generally always true of positive or negative karma. We might create positive or negative karma in this life, but we never really know when it will ripen. We'll talk about karma as we go along, but in general, we know that when we create a karmic seed, a karmic tendency in the mind, that it will ripen. But generally, we can never really say when, with the exception of these five things that are understood to be so intensely powerful that unless they're really, really dealt with, they, at the time of the death in the lifetime in which they were created, they will bring about a very intensely negative result, meaning we don't really have much time to deal with them. And that kind of time pressure is what would kind of negatively color that kind of existence. And those five actions are to intentionally take the life of one's biological mother or father, to take the life of an arhat. So we said that an arhat is someone who has a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. Um, to do what they call maliciously drawing the blood of a Buddha, or maliciously wounding a Buddha. And this comes from a story in the sutras where there was a cousin Devadatta of the Buddha, the historical Buddha, who was, really seemed to be really maybe sort of jealous, envious, disliked the Buddha very much, and tried to actually kill him a number of times. But the Buddha, being omniscient, was able to always kind of know what was going to happen, was able to kind of get out of the way. But apparently there was this one time when Devadatta rolled down like a boulder down a hill, and it smashed into, the side of a mountain or something, and it broke into, his intent was to crush the Buddha with this huge boulder. Um, but the Buddha, being omniscient, was able to actually track every single piece of the shrapnel of this sort of exploding boulder, except for this really tiny sliver that I guess drew a line of, a thin line of blood on his skin somewhere, because there were just so many hundreds of thousands of shards that even the Buddha couldn't get out of the way of every single one of them in this line, and whether the story is just kind of meant to be a parable, who knows. Um, but basically, the idea is that Buddhas, unlike arhats can be killed because they're not omniscient. Buddhas have these additional powers, and they're much more difficult to kill from what it sounds like. But there was this time when the blood of the Buddha was maliciously drawn, um, and that is incredibly heavy negative karma. And then the fifth is to cause what's called a schism in the Sangha. So a Sangha in this context is a monastic community that is kind of functional and harmonious and, dedicated to everyone there working for the benefit of sentient beings. And you kind of go into that community and you intentionally spread disharmony, division, and you kind of cause that community to cease to function. That's a very heavy negative karma because those people were productively working toward enlightenment, and you've kind of thrown a wrench in that whole thing. So don't do that. That's not good. So these are five relatively easy things to avoid. Not killing one's biological mother or father, or an arhat, or maliciously wounding a Buddha, or creating a schism in the Sangha. If you do those, then it's bad news. So don't. Um, and then the last is that we have some confidence in the teachings. We have some genuine interest in spirituality. We have some genuine interest in wanting to develop our minds in a positive direction, as opposed to many people who wouldn't be spending their time trying to understand these things, who just only care about getting more power, more money, more things, more status. We genuinely we make mistakes, we do unskillful things, but we really are interested in trying to develop the mind, and that's incredibly important. That's a necessary precondition to actually being able to make spiritual progress, is developing a genuine interest. Okay, any thoughts or questions about precious human rebirth? So then verse 3. So now the next topic is death and impermanence. So we kind of just got done contemplating like how amazing what we have is, right? All of these negative things that, we have experienced in the past, that it's certainly possible that we might experience again in the future. And then all of these, amazing qualities that, are uplifting and supporting our spiritual growth and our development, and just how extraordinary all of that is. We really tried to get in tune with that by studying all of those. There were actually 18 different qualities between all of the endowments and all of the freedoms. So we really, we try to study those and memorize those and meditate to get a real sense of just how extraordinary this life is. And now we're confronted with the fact that it's not going to last forever, that it is impermanent, and that our death is coming. So what all of this is kind of setting the stage, the foundation for, not, because if we look at the first where it says, unceasingly day and night take its essence, what we're trying to overcome with the first verse of Precious Human Rebirth is not taking what we have for granted. That's what we're trying to really overcome with that particular insight. Not just, we look at the world and we think, oh, there's 8 billion humans, not such a big deal. It must be super easy. It must be, there's just everybody's human. And so there's no real sense of urgency to things. Um, and we think that the causes and the conditions to get that are, just no big deal. But when we really understand all of, all of what goes into that and how incredibly rare it is and how incredibly precious it is, then as it says in the first verse or second verse, um, then we will really take the essence of that kind of life. We won't just waste it. We won't just it won't be good enough for us to just be lost in distraction and lost in non-virtue, because we see how if we want more of that, we have to create the conditions for more of that. And if we look, if we look at that again, um, the actual verse, here it says, is found only once, but then it says is difficult to find again. So we can see how those two statements can't be literally simultaneously true, right? If it's found only once, then we can't say that it's only difficult to find again. But what that's getting at is when they say found only once, what they're kind of saying is that for the causes and the conditions to come together for a precious human rebirth, which is again a subset of human rebirth, for those causes and those conditions to come together kind of from a lower realm rebirth is unbelievably rare, is just something that almost never happens, as if it happened only the one time. It's not technically true, but that way of it coming together is, kind of like emerging out of the lower realms and then coming into not just a human rebirth, but a precious human rebirth. For all of that to happen, it's as if it doesn't happen. Um, but then when it says difficult to find again, what that's getting at is this is actually what we have now, though. And because we have it, our next incarnation, by definition, isn't one in which our mind is emerging out of the lower realms. Our mind is just transitioning out of this lifetime being a perfect human or precious human lifetime rebirth. So, because we are in possession of it, yes, it's not, that doesn't mean that it's a cakewalk to create the causes and the conditions to get more of it. But certainly, compared to the causes and the conditions coming together, just emerging out of, say, the lower realms, is unbelievably different. So we really do have the power, if we generate the mind, as it says, that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. We have the opportunity to use a precious human rebirth to create a succession of perfect human rebirths in which we can complete all of the training, all of the stages of the path. If we don't, in fact, complete it within this one human lifetime, which is possible. There are practitioners who do that in just one lifetime. It's not common, but it can happen. Um, so I just wanted to kind of highlight why it kind of seems contradictory, but it's not. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so this is what we'll end on today. Verse 3, impermanence and death. So guess we're kind of ending on a bummer. So unfortunately, it is true, and we do have to confront the reality that this perfect human or precious human rebirth isn't something that will last forever. This lifetime is going to come to an end. And we don't know when. We can't say that we definitely have X number of more years to practice. We can't say that, all people live to be 90 years old and all people die peacefully, in their beds, surrounded by, supportive. It's just not true. We might be dead in the next 20 minutes. There are people, if we look at the world, if we look at the 8 billion people, in the next 20 minutes, there are people who will die. And there's no reason that we wouldn't be one of them. Not all of them are terminally ill. Not all of them, are like, breathing their last. Some of them are about to, you know, befall some sort of violence or, an accident or, all kinds, or a sudden heart attack or a stroke or, there's all kinds of things that, that's just true. That's just reality. And so we can't, the idea here is that we can't bury our heads in the sand to that fact. And the problem is that we're really good at burying our heads in the sand to that fact. So, I mean, none of us would say to someone, I will never die, right? We would never, in a conversation, we would never say, never express that view. But it's also the case that we are all basically convinced that we are not going to die today. And when we wake up tomorrow, we're equally convinced that we're not going to die tomorrow. And then we're going to wake up the next day, hopefully. And when that happens, we're going to be equally convinced we're not going to die that day. And the problem is that we're going to be wrong one of those days. And if we live all of those remaining days with that kind of view that, that we hold in a subconscious or unconscious way, it's really not different than actually saying to someone, I will never die. It's really, in practice, the practical effect of that isn't really different than, actually holding the idea or holding the view that I am actually immortal, which is a crazy, thing to think or to say, and something that we wouldn't think or say. But it's true that we're acting day by day in a way that is in line with this wisdom, in line with this understanding. Because if we hold on to that or we grasp at this idea that I definitely won't die today and I definitely won't die tomorrow or the day after or the day after, then is that view helping us to delay our practice? Is that view giving us the illusion that we can just wait until, oh, geez, sorry, my computer made a noise. It scared me. Um, are we just delaying it? Are we saying, well, the time isn't right, that I can wait until I get a different job or I retire or, some other cause or condition comes together, because that's going to happen. And then we're going to find some other reason why the time still isn't right. And then we're going to make another benchmark, and then that's going to happen. And then the time still isn't going to be right. So this grasping that we have on this idea of permanence is also a real obstacle, just like the obstacle of taking our life for granted was the first obstacle. The second obstacle is thinking that we always have more time, that we can always just practice later. Um, and so these contemplations, we would call them analytical meditations in Buddhism, or contemplations. These are presenting us with antidotes to problematic ways of thinking or obstacles. So the first obstacle that we overcame is the obstacle of taking our life for granted. Now we're overcoming the obstacle of grasping at permanence and just always thinking that we don't really need to start practicing right now because things aren't ideal next year, and in 5 years, that's when things will calm down. That's when I should start practicing. But we might be dead in a week, and so grasping at permanence is going to rob us of taking the essence of this life, of really engaging in a path of consistent spiritual practice. And then the next we will not go into, but the next, karma is the next thing, because it says, after death, when we die, then we will not just cease to exist, we will take rebirth, and we will take rebirth under the influence of the karma that we've created. So that's what we'll look at next week. Mm-hmm.
When they say rebirth, are they always referring to being reborn as a baby in a new family? Is that what they're always referring to?
So the mind, it refers to the mind disconnecting from this form and taking a different form. Um, but and so for humans and animals, then it would be, as you're describing, humans and animals, generally have mothers and fathers, and they're generally born from, either a womb or an egg. Um, so it kind of follows that trajectory that you're describing. But in terms of the other realms, the mind that we have that's experiencing this life is the same mind that's capable of just going directly to experiencing not just an animal realm kind of experience, but also the hell realms, the spirit realms, the celestial. And those are generally what they call miraculous, where it's just, you just sort of pop into existence. They're more energetic. So there's different kinds of rebirth. There's, and that's called miraculous, is where you just sort of come into being, because it's a more energetic, it's a less sort of physical process.
It's either miraculous or being a baby, one of those two.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. All right, thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions? Nope. All right. So we will pick it up here next week, and we've got two more sessions. And then, as I mentioned, it's Meditation 101 is what happens next month. But yeah,
Thank you,
and
Venerable.
of course,
Bye, thank you.
have a good weekend.